Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. So the lineage of this secret government rogue network that has come now to the fore with the Major Hassan case and indeed the Detroit Christmas Flying Patsy. Theodore Roosevelt represents the reunion after the Civil War of the Confederate branch and the Wall Street branch of this, and he puts that into his own administration. This is when the FBI is founded, under a descendant of Bonaparte. This is Charles Bonaparte, direct lineal descendant of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte of France. That's the FBI. But Theodore Roosevelt, having this attention span of a 6-year-old boy, he decides he's had enough of the presidency. He wants to go hunting, and then we get Taft, and the forces of Morgan and London are not happy with Taft. They're not getting what they need. Taft wants to get a second term in 1912. So Morgan brings Theodore Roosevelt back from retirement and founds this Bull Moose or Liberal Republican Party, which then succeeds in defeating Taft, splitting the Republican vote, and bringing in Woodrow Wilson. We talked about Woodrow Wilson last week. This is the first man from a Confederate state elected president after the Civil War. He's generally under the control of Colonel House, a pro-British controller. And the big issue is, first we get the Federal Reserve Act under the first term of Woodrow Wilson, and that's bad enough. I think we get the income tax, the idea being that they're not going to rely on a protective tariff, which would have been the way to go and remains the way to go. If you don't like an income tax, you better be for a protective tariff. So don't say, I'm against the income tax and I want free trade. No. If you don't want the income tax, you better be for a protective tariff. And I am, although I think the income tax, it's not going to be able to abolish it completely, but we can certainly provide tremendous tax relief. Anyway, 1916, we have Woodrow Wilson running for re-election. He kept us out of war, but at the end of 1916, after he's been reelected, Morgan goes to Woodrow Wilson and says, Woody, we are facing the fact that the British and the French are now bankrupt and they're about to collapse. If they collapse, Wall Street collapses, the U.S. goes into a depression, and you are politically going to be left holding the bag. So that is when Wilson then begins to mobilize in his second term and gets the United States into World War I, which is an absolute disaster. This is what, instead of having a normal negotiated peace, we get this Carthaginian Versailles Treaty with reparations, with all the rest of it, that then opens the door to Hitler, as Keynes and others understood to some degree at the time. There's also the big fight about, will the U.S. have naval supremacy, and this comes up under Harding. We get people in the U.S. Navy who want to have naval supremacy over the British. We get General Billy Mitchell, who wants to use air power to defeat British naval supremacy. The death of Harding, a very, very suspicious one, after a trip to Canada. And then we get, generally speaking, the invisible government during the 1920s expressed through Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, under whom Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover served. This, of course, then leads to a world economic depression with the help of Montague Norman of the Bank of England and Sir Winston Churchill, monkeying with the British pound during the 1920s. By the time we get to 1932, we've got Franklin D. Roosevelt, who is a declared enemy, the most successful enemy of the invisible government that there has ever been. Those who do not understand this are, historically speaking, dolts. There's nothing more to say. This is a fantastic mythological view of history that some of these Roosevelt haters have. And the proof is simply, what does Morgan do vis-a-vis Roosevelt? Well, the first thing is to attempt to kill him. That's the assassination attempt on Roosevelt in Florida in early 1933, just as Hitler is seizing power in Germany with Morgan backing and London backing. They attempt to kill Roosevelt. Instead, they kill the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Chernak. That didn't work. Then later, we get the Morgan coup, right? The Smedley-Butler revelations before a committee of Congress that Morgan and other financiers want to organize a Mussolini march on Rome, except it's going to be a march on Washington. They also backed the Liberty League, Lindbergh. You got to recognize that the U.S. ruling class in the 1930s is largely almost 100% pro-fascist and largely pro-Nazi. That would be the Dulles brothers and, of course, Prescott Bush. Pearl Harbor. Who does Pearl Harbor? Well, that is essentially Colonel Stimson, General Marshall, and Admiral Richmond K. Turner with the help of Sir Winston Churchill, they are the ones who withhold intelligence. It's not Roosevelt withholding intelligence from the admirals. It's Stimson, Marshall, Turner, and their clique withholding intelligence from the commanders in Pearl Harbor, sure, but also withholding it from Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's another invisible government rogue network operation. With the coming of Truman, the invisible government rejoices because now they have a puppet. There is a report, of course, from Elliott Roosevelt that Winston Churchill and his group poisoned FDR. That is reported by Elliott Roosevelt based on a report from Stalin. This is the famous Parade magazine 1967 interview with Elliott Roosevelt. With Truman, we get a pliable puppet, former Ku Klux Klan member. He is run by Atchison from the State Department, Harriman of Skull and Bones, and the Clark Clifford, who actually writes a book about how they ran Truman. The goal here now is to start the Cold War. They want the Cold War with the Soviets. They want the U.S. to block with the British, not with the Soviets. That is the tragic story of the post-war period. Allen Dulles acting behind the scenes. During the 1950s, the Dulles brothers, Allen at the CIA and John Foster at the State Department, box in any possible positive instincts of Eisenhower, but after John Foster Dulles dies, Eisenhower becomes more positive. Eisenhower in 1960 is looking for a deal with Khrushchev to avoid the Berlin crises, and this is when the Dulles brothers sabotage the U-2 to wreck the Paris peace conference of 1960 with the Francis Gary Powers affair and so forth, so that Khrushchev cannot make a deal. When you get Kennedy coming in, and we just told the story, right? The Dulles, Allen Dulles goes to him and says, "Time for the Bay of Pigs. It's going to be great." Kennedy learns from this that he cannot trust the invisible government. And when we get the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Curtis LeMay and other loony birds come forward with proposals for war with the Soviet Union, Kennedy's answer, no, no, no. The American University speech offering détente and the better relations to the Soviets, followed then by Dallas. Under Johnson, they force him into the Vietnam War, escalation, the Gulf of Tonkin incident masterminded by the secret government. Under Nixon, we have the Watergate affair. Watergate, widely misunderstood. Watergate is a coup by the CIA, by the secret government, against the presidency, to weaken the presidency and to decrease the power of the constitutional government. That is the Watergate coup. It is a coup, but it's a coup by the CIA. Nixon, of course, did have criminal intent, but he's simply an expendable person. It also means that the people like Ellsberg and Kissinger, the Pentagon Papers, and so forth, have to be seen within the framework of a CIA operation. By the time we get to Carter, we're back to Paul Adolph Volcker at the Federal Reserve. The Desert One failure, the failure to free the hostages, possibly representing some kind of meddling by the invisible government. But by the time we then get into the 1980s, it's Iran-Contra all the way, invisible government operation, George Bush the Elder, the covert operations czar of Reagan, the drooling, sleepwalking president. So this goes on all during the 1980s. The 1990s, they shift their field into Islamic terrorism. And then, of course, by the end of the decade, 1999, under Clinton, the bombing of Serbia, which is ordered by Al Gore, protege of Prince Charles, and really more of an invisible government operative than anything else. And that's, of course, an affront to the Soviets. And then, of course, we get 9/11, the rogue B-52, and then this year, Major Hassan and Muttalib. That's what you're dealing with. That's the rogue network, older than Bush, older than Clinton, older than Obama, and we'll be back in a minute.